Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm continuing my exploration of London's docklands today, east of London. Today I'm on the south side of the River Thames in Rotherhithe. Some riverside pubs, some a little bit more inland. Pub number one, the Old Justice. Cheers from the Old Justice. Harvey's Sussex Best on tap. I'm having a half of that is in very good shape. I'm happy to report this is another wonderful example of a pub being brought back from the brink. It was closed for around about 5 years. A lot of the interior was actually temporarily removed in, I believe, 2017. A combination of Southwark Council and Historic England stepped in to draft an emergency listing for the building, and even though on the day that the listing was notified the developers had already started stripping out some of that material, they were then ordered to restore it. The current building dates to 1933 and was designed by Sidney Charles Clark, who was the chief architect for Charrington's Brewery. It's built in a neo-Tudor style, also sometimes called mock Tudor or brewer's Tudor. It's built of red brick with some of the upper floors partially covered in timber. It still has the very faded old Charrington sign for the pub, which has a judge's head on one side and what appears to be a set of stocks on the reverse. There's also a pair of Charrington's lamps with the Toby Jug emblem on them. The interior is on Camera's list of historic pub interiors. They give it a 2-star rating, and I suspect that some of their description was used to inform Historic England's listing, considering that that was then in turn used to enforce the restoration of the building. That sort of underlines the importance of the work of Camera's Pub Heritage Group. The public bar is at the front of the pub, and the panelling here on the walls has vertical grooves, including the doors to the toilets. There is a brick fireplace with a plasterwork Charrington's Toby Jug logo in the overmantel. The bar counter is of a similar light oak, and the bar back has a leaded mirror panelling. A tiled step around the bar counter acts as a footrest. To the side of the bar counter here, there is now a short corridor leading through to the saloon bar, but that is slightly newer, and originally access to the two bar rooms would only have been via the external doors. In the saloon bar, the bar counter and bar back are of a similar style. However, the panelling on the walls in the saloon bar is different. It's fielded rather than having those vertical grooves. There are 2 further brick fireplaces here, although the overmantels are wood rather than brick and contain picture frames. There's a piano which looks 1930s in style to me. One corner has a space which is now a snug, but would originally have been a short connecting passage to the bar counter for off sales. You can see the doorway to that at the exterior, the former doorway. One of the panels in that snug space opens, and I think that may possibly have been a serving hatch originally. Despite that blip where parts of the interior were temporarily removed, this is a very well preserved example of a 1930s pub, and also, as detailed in the Historic England listing, it's an example of an improved pub. The idea that the brewery was trying to promote a more family-friendly environment and less drunken excess. I get the sense today that this is very much a pub for the local community, perhaps not as famous as some of its near neighbours like the Angel or the Mayflower, but a pub that would appeal to people of multiple generations from the 20s up until their 90s. I had a very warm welcome from the staff, and I do hope this pub has a bright future from here on. It is a surprisingly old pub with records for it going back to 1807. The former incarnation of the pub nearly burnt down in 1822. You can see the site of the pub marked with a PH for public house on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, and again it appears on the mid-20th century version of that map, with the name of the pub, Old Justice, also clearly marked. More recently, its main claim to fame is that it was used in the filming of a Paul McCartney video. The song is No More Lonely Nights. You can find that on YouTube. I'll stick a link to that in one of those corners. And at around 2.5 minutes in, 2 minutes 33, you can clearly see Sir Paul standing outside the pub here, more or less where I'm sat now. Pub number 2, the Angel. It is a listed building, and Historic England believe the current building dates from likely the 1830s, although may incorporate some parts of an earlier 17th century building. This is, of course, a riverside pub, and so it presents two quite different frontages to us. The one facing inland is of stock brick, has that lovely curved corner and a timber ground floor. I was fortunate on my visit to be here around low tide, so I could get down onto the foreshore and see the river frontage from that angle, which is quite different from the frontage onto the street. It has a weatherboarded exterior, it's supported by wooden posts that go down into the river at higher tides, and there is a balcony there that wraps round to the left. Immediately adjoining the pub is a set of stairs that I believe today is known as platform stairs, but was originally known as Rotherhithe stairs, and these provide access down to the foreshore, although as I say only at low tide. There are three distinct entrances to the pub, which in turn lead on to three different partitioned off spaces within the main bar room on the ground floor, the saloon bar, private bar and the public bar. All three of those main spaces on the ground floor are served by a central, slightly horseshoe shaped servery. The Angel doesn't feature on camera's list of historic pub interiors, instead being mentioned on their outstanding conversions and restorations site. The description therefore is relatively brief from camera, but they talk about the interior having these typical partitioned spaces that are very common in these Sam Smith's pubs. The saloon bar today, accessed by that door at the corner, is probably the one that gets most of the footfall. The saloon bar also has rather nice open fire lit by coal on my visit. The public bar over the other side is probably the space I imagine that gets occupied by the locals on busier days at weekends and on sunny days when the landlord told me that the queue can be right out the door, as this is a very scenic spot. It has a dartboard, another open fire, and some nice old prints of the local area on one of the walls. There is also an upstairs room, which perhaps feels a bit more intended for dining. That has a slight feeling of a captain's cabin on the back of a ship and offers really impressive views along the River Thames to Tower Bridge. Possibly most people know this pub for its adjoining terrace, which I think is actually just public land. It's not actually part of the pub's grounds, but people spill out onto there and enjoy their drinks and the wonderful views that you get of Tower Bridge from there, including fantastic sunsets if the weather is right. There are claims that there may have been a pub on this site dating back to the 17th century and of this name. I wasn't able to prove or disprove that. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for it was from 1767. There was certainly a building here, although we can't tell what it was used for at the time of Hallward's map of 1799 adjoining Rotherhithe Stairs. On Goad's map of 1887 it's marked with a PH for public house, again next to Rotherhithe Stairs. In 1890 the Art Journal had a wonderful article about riverside inns. I referred to this a few times in that Wapping video, and that has a drawing of the Angel. Note here the Courage sign on the side of the pub. That's appropriate, as the Courage Brewery was based at Shad Thames next to Tower Bridge. That was very close by here, and you can clearly see the vast extent of the Courage Brewery next to Tower Bridge on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. The Angel is also clearly marked on the 1890s OS map with a PH for public house next to Rotherhithe Stairs, which at that time seems to have been renamed to Platform Stairs, the name that it has today. And again, you can clearly see it marked on that mid-20th century version of the OS map with the name of the pub there as well. In 1977, the Angel won the Evening Standard's Pub of the River Award, and to celebrate that there was a short article about the pub's history, including a tantalising mention of a mortgage document dating to 1682 that proves the pub's existence at that time. It is, of course, a Sam Smith's pub today. Sorry I didn't get a very comprehensive shot of the beer lineup on the bar, but you can imagine the usual Sam Smith's beer lineup. I went for a half of the 4X bitter. Worth noting, I think all of their beers are keg. It was fairly quiet on my visit, it being a weekday lunchtime on a not particularly sunny day in April, but at weekends, on sunny days, it can be extremely busy here with long queues and people wanting to enjoy the views along the river to Tower Bridge. I've been here many times before and often enjoyed those views myself. It is a really spectacular spot, especially if you can be here around sunset. Pub number 3, The Ship. Cheers from the ship. I'm having a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord, which came in at £2.50, which I thought was quite reasonable by London standards. Unlike the previous two pubs, this isn't a listed building and it's not on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors or its site for outstanding conversions and renovations. So there's not quite so much to go on in terms of written material. The What Pub site from CAMRA states that the current building likely dates to the first quarter of the 20th century. I'm not convinced that can be quite right because there is an old photo from 1937 which appears to show the corner of St Mary Church Street and Elephant Lane, which is where the pub resides today, and there is another building in place there, something like a newsagent's. So I think this building likely dates from the late 1930s, and the style of it seems to agree with that. It's mostly built of brick, and there are some ceramic tiles at the ground floor level. There's also quite an attractive beer garden to the rear, a little courtyard garden at the back of the pub. Inside, it is a single open plan bar room today, but there is a hint on at least one of the exterior doors that there may have been a separation at some time between a saloon bar and possibly a public bar. The space is served by another horseshoe-shaped bar counter, which I suppose could date from the 1930s, although it's a bit more angular rather than the more curved bar counters that you'd expect from that era. There is a nautical theme to much of the decor, with a collection of model ships on high shelves and other bits of maritime memorabilia here and there. Also at least one brick fireplace, which looks again like it could be 1930s to me. It seems as though this pub actually moved across the street. The name was preserved and the original location was probably just the other side of Mary Church, or St Mary Church Street, which at that time was just called Church Street. And actually from the beer garden of the pub, if you look through the gates, you can get a glimpse of a new development that is now on the site of where the pub once was. And in that location, it goes back to possibly the 1760s. The earliest mention that I could find for it was from the General Evening Post in 1761, advertising a meeting with the freemen of the borough of Great Yarmouth, and Sir Edward Walpole would be in attendance. He was the MP for Great Yarmouth from 1734 to 1768. So you can see a public house marked at that location immediately across the road from where the ship now stands on some later maps. For example, it is here on Gode's 1887 map, and again in the Ordnance Survey map from the 1890s. This is much more of a locals pub than its two famous neighbours, the Angel and the Mayflower, and it may not have the historic appeal or the views of its riverside neighbours, but if you're in the area and you're looking for a nice quiet local for a quiet pint, then this could be the pub for you. Pub number 4, the Mayflower. Cheers from the Mayflower. This is a pint of their scurvy ale. This is, of course, a very famous pub, arguably the most famous in Rotherhithe. It's quite a distinctive looking building, black and white, with its hipped roof and its leaded windows. It was damaged by bombing in World War II and was extensively refurbished and possibly even partly rebuilt in the 1950s. Like the Angel, this is another pub that is directly on the river, so we again have two different frontages to consider. The one facing the street has what I believe to be a milestone. It says London Bridge 2 miles, and I think that is actually marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map with an MS. Also on one corner are what appear to be parish boundary markers. To one side of the pub is an ancient right-of-way called Church Stairs, which leads down to the foreshore. I was there on my visit not long after low tide, but the foreshore here is not nearly as extensive as it is at the Angel, so it's hard to get to a vantage point where you can get a really good view of the pub. You probably would be best to see that from a boat. You can at least get underneath the decking at the back of the pub and walk amongst the timbers, but it is a little bit precarious and probably best avoided by anyone who is not particularly sure-footed. Interestingly, this is not a listed building, however it is on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. Bit difficult to do the interior shots today. It is still surprisingly busy. It is a weekday afternoon after 2 p.m. Still quite a lot of people occupying most of the interior, so hard to get the shots without disturbing the other customers. Most of the interior likely dates from that remodelling of around about 1956 or 1957. It's a collection of mainly nautical knickknacks. There are things like a ship's wheel here, there are ship's lanterns, some parts of a ship's rigging, a life ring, various other knickknacks, including this interesting example of taxidermy. Towards the back of the main bar room is a large brick fireplace with a lintel and a stag's head over the top. There's also an upstairs dining room which offers slightly better views out over the river, and some high-backed settles with novelty motifs on. And I think the stairwell is pretty interesting and is lined with various prints and pictures. Actually having my lunch here, a bit of a late lunch, but I have a bit of a gap until the 5th pub opens, so I'm going to have some halloumi fries of some description and then sausage and mash. These look pretty good to me. The pub's main claim to fame is of course that the ship after which it was named purportedly set sail from here in 1620 and then went on to carry the Pilgrim Fathers to America. They of course played a very important role in the founding of that country. To be clear, I don't think that there is any suggestion that the Pilgrim Fathers actually came to this pub. They were after all Puritans, and I believe that they joined the boat at Southampton. So this was possibly the home port of the Mayflower. This was where it was docked when it wasn't on a voyage. The captain lived here, Christopher Jones, and in fact returned here after that significant voyage across the Atlantic and back again in 1621. He died about a year later and is buried in nearby Rotherhithe Church, St Mary's Church. Some sources claim that there has been a pub on this site going back to 1550 and it was originally known as the Ship Inn. I'm not convinced that that is the case. We have two maps from the 17th century to consult which may provide some hints about whether or not this pub was here at that time. Newcourt's map of 1658 does show a row of houses along the riverbank in this location at Rotherhithe, but it's unclear to me whether that might be more of a sort of artist's interpretation and whether or not it was meant to faithfully represent the exact location of buildings at that time. A little later is William Morgan's map in 1682, which I get the sense does try to give a more accurate depiction of the footprint of all the buildings in any given area, and it appears to me at that time that, assuming those shaded areas are buildings, that actually this stretch here immediately to the right of Church Stairs was not at that time built on. So I'm not entirely convinced that there was a pub here in the 1600s. At the time of Horwood's 1799 map, the outline of the building is much clearer. Looking at the usual Sun Fire Office insurance records, the earliest that appears to relate to this pub is from 1782. It's widely reported that this pub was at one time called either the Spread Eagle or the Spread Eagle and Crown. A slightly earlier than that mention in 1777 in the reports of the Humane Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. The pub featured in one of those wonderful British Pathé videos of 1949 due to the oddity of it functioning as a post office. More recently than that, I found some charming adverts for a drink called Rossane, which I suspect is a cousin of Babycham. It appears to be a sort of diminutive format bottle containing a sparkling wine, and unlike Babycham, which was in fact perry, made from pears, I believe Rossane, made by the same producer, Showerings, was in fact made from grapes. And part of the advertising material showed some pictures of people enjoying it at, as it was then, the Spread Eagle and Crown here in Rotherhithe. The name of the pub changed around about 1956 to the Mayflower as we know it today. My main course has arrived, sausages and mash. Pub number 5, the Blacksmith's Arms. I think it's worth mentioning that this is a fair trek from the previous pub. It's a good 20-minute at least walk from the Mayflower, about a mile away. Cheers from the Blacksmith's Arms here at the furthest extreme of Rotherhithe. I'm having a half of Seafarers, a little bit on the cloudy side, but it tastes all right, I guess. This is in fact a Victorian building, but it has, as you can tell from the exterior there, been subjected to a mock Tudor makeover in the 1930s. It has a half-timbered facade on top of brick, and there's some glazed ceramic tiles to the base. This is another on camera's list of historic pub interiors, and it gets a mention there with a 1-star rating for its interwall fittings inside. Roughly 3 bar rooms inside, with an island bar counter in the middle linking the 2 main bar rooms, and then a dining area out the back. The bar counter with its rounded corners jumps out as being very distinctively interwar in style. The partitions are also quite interesting. There's both one towards the front of the pub that separates the 2 halves of what is now a more opened out bar room, and that's partially glazed, and interestingly has a folding door that could be used to close that partition entirely, and that appears to still be functional, which is quite an unusual feature. Towards the back there is also a second partition, also partly glazed, that divides the dining area from those 2 front bar rooms. Presumably at one time those 2 bar rooms would have been some combination of saloon bar and public bar, and there are 2 distinct entrances at the exterior to access those. A couple of interesting curios around the bar counter. There is a plaque in 2 sides of the bar counter that marks the height that a flood reached in 1928. Also, the footrail around the bar is apparently heated and actually still functional today. It wasn't on during my visit because I assume the main heating is not on. Another curio towards the back of the pub in the dining area, there's a small diamond-shaped brass plate with what looks like a coin slot in the middle of it. This is apparently called a penny drop, and it's a pub game where you held a coin in your mouth, dropped it while standing up, and if you actually managed to successfully get the coin in the slot, then you'd get a free drink. I assume that's no longer in service today. There is also a photo of the Queen Mother on the wall. In fact, I think 2 prints of it, and that recounts a visit that she made here in 1988. The legend goes that it wasn't an official planned visit, she just happened to be passing by and thought she would pop in. It's close to a point in the river called Cuckold's Point, and that is apparently depicted in Hogarth's Industry and Idleness, Plate 5, which was created in 1747. You can see 5 men in a rowing boat there with the shoreline and some windmills along it, and possibly where that gibbet, that scaffold is the location of Cuckold's Point. I'm not sure how reliable that setting is. On a map of around the same time, John Rock's map of 1746, you can see windmills lining one bank of the Thames here, but it's the opposite bank to this one. This stretch of the Thames is also apparently depicted in Samuel Scott's painting of around the 1750s, and it looks a little bit to me as though the gibbet that famously always stood here at Cuckold's Point was at that time being repurposed as a pub sign, and it's tempting to believe that could have been some earlier incarnation of this pub. Thought for a bit of added drama I would end the video on a boat. This is the ferry going across to Canary Wharf, so I hope that's been an interesting tour of Rotherhithe for you. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.